Just want to say thank you for coming out. My name is Jason Hogstad. I'm a staff member with the Louisville Historical Museum. I really appreciate you all taking time on a rather cold evening after a snow to be here for what I think is possibly one of the most serious, if not important, conversations we can have about our community's history. A few housekeeping things. I do want to say that I'm a firm believer, especially with a small group like this, in kind of clearing up clarifications or I guess confusions early on in the talk. So if at any point you are unsure about what I'm saying, you're a little uncertain about the points I'm making, just throw up your hand. I'll call on you and we can kind of have that question be answered at the moment. The reason I think it can be important to do that is simply because the reality is if you're uncertain about something, odds are somebody else is as well. We will have a Q&A at the end, but since it's this group that we have, this cozy group, we can also address questions as we go through. The other thing I wanted to kind of ask, and I think I might actually know it, but as you can see, this is part 2 of a 2-part talk. Has everyone read or either heard the first part? Okay, awesome. Great. I am going to do a quick recap, simply to kind of get us all on the same page, but I won't focus too much on it because people are kind of aware of that content. And we can kind of go ahead and start with that. So the first thing I want to say is that the Prohibition period in Louisville is probably one of the most pivotal periods in our town's history. At least that's the claim tonight, and I think you'll kind of see why. So that period went from 1916 to 1933 in Colorado, and during that period, several things happened that were going to have ramifications for decades to come. Things are going to occur within this time period that set Louisville on uncertain, I would say, pretty important pathways. Now, at its core, this period was actually about who could be an American and who would hold power in our country. So we'll talk a little bit about alcohol. In fact, those conversations about Americanism or who was worthy of being an American were playing out across the country. They were happening in Louisville. And often in this period, those conversations did include some sort of discussion of alcohol. Not always, there were other ways this discussion played out, but alcohol was central to these conversations. Now, Prohibition, as everybody is kind of aware, was about the criminalization of alcohol, its consumption, manufacture, or sale, sometimes transportation, depending on how the local laws went. And I want to point out, and this is an image of an establishment in Louisville, Celeste, which was actually just like half a block that way, kind of by the Waterloo. I want to apologize to anybody in this picture or their descendants if I'm wrong about this, but as near as I can tell, everybody in this image is holding a beer, looking at the glasses, based on kind of just the way the beverage looks. Also, based on what's going on in this image, it is 1921. There's a calendar in the back. The takeaway might be kind of funny and humorous, but it's simply this. Prohibition did not seem to stop Louisville from drinking. Now, it did make doing things with alcohol a lot riskier. This is an image of Robert Blum. He was the sheriff in Boulder County in the 20s, and he's raiding a bootlegging operation in Lafayette. Prohibition meant that there could be serious ramifications for choosing to engage in kind of alcohol-related activities. Specifically, you can be fined sometimes significantly for individuals based on how little money they were making in Louisville. And you could also have prison time. Serving a month in prison, serving a year in prison can be a major disruption to one's life. The 20s were further complicated by these folks. As you're all probably aware, but it's worth remembering because we're going to kind of talk about them. The Klan in Colorado was quite popular, and they actually were popular in part because they used fears about alcohol consumption and immorality to leverage kind of their popularity. So they promised Americans a chance to do something about perceived immorality, and that's one of the reasons that so many people joined the Klan at this time period. I also want to, they were equal opportunity bigots, I want that quite clear. They were anti-Black, anti-Semitic, anti-Asian, and anti-immigrant in the 20s. They were also around. In Louisville, the Klan looked like this. We know that they were marching down Main Street. We know that they burned crosses throughout town. We know that they used their influence to unevenly enforce Prohibition. We talked about this in part one, but one of the federal Prohibition officers in the area was in the Klan, and he made no bones about his disdain for individuals who were not of English ancestry, and seems to have been quite willing to use his power to arrest immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe for Prohibition violations. All told, the goal of the Klan was simply this: they wanted to make sure that the only people in power were Anglo-Saxon, which truly is kind of a fictitious ethnic category. It doesn't exist. It was actually made up far after the period that it's supposed to reference. They wanted people who were Anglo-Saxon as well as Protestant to be in power. So mostly a quick recap of part one, except for this as well. So the Klan was definitely targeting individuals who were Italian and Italian Catholic or Italian American in Louisville at the time. I don't want to diminish the terror of the Klan. By all means, they were serious, they were horrible. But we don't see a significant decline in the presence of Italians in Louisville during this period. In fact, we actually see a few Italian residents being able to leverage the potential profits from bootlegging to start several foundational downtown businesses. If you were familiar with the Blue Parrot and the several Italian restaurants that it spawned, according to family lore, that restaurant only existed because of bootlegging, which were used to kind of supplement early years of operation. So it's fair to say that in the Prohibition period, Louisville, well, the foundation is laid for Louisville to go from being a place with Italians to a place known for its Italian community, right? So it gains a reputation, or the roots are laid for it to gain a reputation as an Italian place. But this is what we're talking about tonight. At the same time that all of that was happening, and if individuals want to kind of scoot their chairs because we've got side screens, you can also use the TV as well. I'm just going to, but yeah, it won't be, get comfy. But at the same time as all that is happening, Louisville's Hispanic population is growing by leaps and bounds. You see what is maybe a 7-fold increase between 1920 and 1930 based on this census. Less than 50 individuals, less than 25 individuals even, and then almost 200 residents who were Hispanic by 1930. Honestly, it's not actually only in the last 24 hours that I've been thinking about this, but we have several individuals who were in a city directory who were Hispanic that aren't on the US Census, suggesting this number is actually even higher. Didn't make that not very far leap of logic until last night as I was practicing this. But yeah, fair enough. So it actually isn't given that Louisville was about 2,000 people. So it was, well, we actually first became aware of this because we had a wonderful volunteer who was working on the census. She's sitting here. We started to kind of tabulate or calculate kind of what Louisville's demographics looked like in the 1930 census based on race or ethnicity. And we used the 1930 census, and this is an image of it, because in this decade and only in this decade, Mexican is used as a racial category by the federal government. Now, Mexican, according to the way the census works, could mean individuals who are Hispanic but American citizens. It does not denote political identity or kind of country of origin, although it also is included in those categories. But you could be white, you could be black, or you could be Mexican in the census, right? What that allowed us to do quickly was actually ascertain who was Hispanic in town, recognizing that census takers are not without their flaws, and that identifying, lack of or self-identifying on a census might not always be accurate. But if you flip through the census, that 1930 census for Louisville, you are going to see page after page after page of individuals who are Hispanic who live in town. And to your question, what you actually see, especially including individuals who are in the city directory, is that Hispanic residents make up the second largest ethnic or racial category of Louisville at that time. All right, they're only exceeded by individuals of Italian ancestry. Individuals who either were from Italy or had one parent from Italy make up about a quarter of Louisville in 1930, according to the census. If we're kind of adding in the city directory, we're going to see more than 10% of Louisville is Hispanic. The third category is actually people of English ancestry, England itself. That's kind of who was here. Now, if all this talk did was focus on that rise in population and the arrival of Hispanic individuals to town, I think that would be amazing. There's a lot there to unpack. But tonight we're talking about this full graph. So the other side of this story is that from 1930 to 1940, Louisville's Hispanic population plummets. All right, so not only do we see a tremendous rise during the main portions of Prohibition, but as the Depression is starting and as Prohibition is ending, we see this dramatic drop. I do want to point out here that not everybody who is Hispanic leaves town in 1940. Right, you kind of see from the graph, right? We have individuals who are Hispanic who do still stay in town. That's critical because one of the things that the museum has been able to do this last year is chat with people who are descended from the families that stayed. So we've been trying to better understand and contextualize the census information with stories that we're getting to hear. And I'll be sharing some of them tonight. Now, what we're going to do tonight is look at two questions. The first is this. We're just going to try to better understand what it was like to be Hispanic in Louisville at the time. That means trying to understand people's lived experience, just to recognize some human dignity, but also trying to do a better job of recognizing the contributions that Hispanic residents were making to make Louisville what it is what it is today. The other thing we're going to do, and this is part of this first question in some ways, is we're going to think about how we know what we know and maybe focus on why we don't know this story. I will say I've worked with the museum for several years. The history of Louisville that I walk around in my head with did not include this. And I think this is a pretty significant shift in Louisville, a pretty significant event in Louisville. And I'm hoping that we can all kind of add it to our understanding of this town's history. It's probably not a surprise. If you want to be able to tell somebody's story, you have to have a source about it. If you're doing history, right? You need to have something written down and a recording, or recorded in some way. It doesn't have to be written. But you need a source that makes its way into the people who work for a museum or historians' hands. In some way, an individual experience needs to be recorded and added to a collective history. I think it probably also stands to reason that the more sources you have and the more types of sources you have, the better picture you have of individuals. You can just flesh people's lives out in the past. The museum uses historic newspapers. It uses official documents like the census or real estate records, anything that's official. It uses oral histories. It uses photographs. It uses artifacts and objects. And we combine these a lot to understand the past. I'm from Oregon. If I want to understand Louisville's history, I need to delve into, do some research in all of these source sets, and then kind of combine things to better understand what Louisville has been like in the past. However, and I've got this graph on the slide again, if you think about what happens when people leave a place, you can realize that they're going to leave less sources, right? Their sources, the sources of their lives, are not going to make it into the hands of a museum. They're not going to be added to the collective kind of history of a place. So look at that graph dropping. You're going to have a lot of people who don't stick around to leave oral histories or to record them later on in their life. You're going to have less of a chance of photographs showing up. There aren't that many photographs in this slideshow, this presentation tonight. And you're also going to not have as many artifacts or objects. You're left with, in some ways, kind of sources that maybe don't humanize people as much. Official documents. Sorry, something popped up on my screen. Official documents, can give us some information about the past, but don't really tell what it's like to be a person. Now, I want to really, really drive this point home about how important it is that we have multiple source sets, and how important it is that we really have multiple source sets for individuals who maybe leave less of a historical record. So this is a map, as near as we can tell. The museum did some work on this, of where Hispanic individuals were living in town in 1930. Now, the color division is not one-to-one. There are some of these circles that could be either color. But I divided this group of people, Hispanic residents in Louisville, by source. The red circles are individuals who showed up in a directory in 1930, and the tan circles are individuals who showed up in a 1930 census. Like I said, there is some overlap, so I guess I could have made a color that was both. But the reality is, if you took one source set away, you'd be missing a significant portion of people. That's kind of how this entire research project has operated. We've been trying to gather as many sources as we can while also recognizing we actually don't know what we don't know. That being said, or yeah.
Could you do the cross streets of that diagram?
Absolutely. So if we look at this on the audience's left, you have Pine here. You have, that's Main Street. This is Front. So we have Main Street, Front. So then you've got Walnut, Spruce, South. Spruce is here. So this is actually a 1909 map of Louisville. I didn't have to go further because Louisville didn't grow much in between those periods. And I do want to say that both the exact numbers, if I mention them at all, or the exact locations, the museum is doing its best, but I want to include an asterisk on all of this, right? For a number of reasons, the census might not be exact to a single-digit tally. For a number of reasons, the museum is including images like this to give people a sense of where Hispanic families were living, and also a sense of how important different source sets are. Right, so please don't walk away with an exact address in your head. That's not the point of this at the moment. We're still doing that work, though. Okay, with that conversation about sources in mind, we're now going to talk about some content. The way we're going to do this is we're going to talk about why Hispanic residents were coming to Louisville. We're going to talk about what it was like to be here, and then we're going to talk about why Hispanic individuals were leaving town, as the census suggests. And our first question is just about why folks showed up. The short and simple answer is simply for jobs. Like a lot of other groups of people, Hispanic residents were coming to town for work, primarily in the coal field, although not always. Now, bear with me. We're going to take a brief detour for a national immigration policy lesson. This is a map. This is a couple of maps showing what was happening in America in the 1920s. As you might remember from the first part, the 1920s were one of the most anti-immigrant and possibly xenophobic periods in American history. As part of that decade, what we saw was the passage of a law, and I talked more about this in part one, in which, for the first time, the US had a quota-based immigration system nationally. That is, only so many people could come from various countries per year. This image comes from the office of one of the senators who sponsored that very xenophobic law that was intended to make sure that America had more people of English ancestry than other places. Now, what you have here in this image is that on the left, and the takeaway, you don't need to focus on the details, but the takeaway is simply this. The darker a country is, the more people are coming from that country to America. The image on the left is what happens before the law is passed. The image on the right is what the senator is promising will happen, and he was right. So you can see that significant portions of Europe end up with less people being allowed to immigrate to America. Specifically, you have less Southern and Eastern European immigration. Now, what that does for our talk tonight is that, I apologize if it's a little tinny, is that major industries, especially around here, which included mining, agriculture, and the railroad, had to look elsewhere for labor. They had to recruit in different places because they had been recruiting in Southern and Eastern Europe and now could not do that anymore because of this law. That leads us to Herman and Fidencia Gomez. Now, they represent one of two pathways that Hispanic residents kind of take to come to Louisville. And I'm going to kind of share their path. So I'm going to share actually a little bit about their family. Fidencia, who's on the left, her great-grandfather was born in Spain. Her paternal grandparents, as well as Herman's, were born in Mexico. Their maternal grandparents were born in the United States, as were their parents, and they themselves were born in Colorado. Now here's the deal. All of those people I just referenced were actually born less than 300 miles from here. Fidencia's great-grandparents were born in New Mexico when it was Spain. Their maternal grandparents were born in New Mexico when it was Mexico. And their maternal grandparents, as well as their parents, were born in New Mexico once it was part of the United States after the Mexican-American War. They themselves, as I mentioned, were born in Colorado. So they represented a significant Hispanic presence of individuals who, well, although they were labeled as Mexican, had actually been in the region for generations. Right? These are individuals who are American citizens. And that's going to be a critical distinction later on. Now, that's not to say that individuals weren't immigrating from Mexico to Louisville. In fact, one of the stories that we collected, we recently heard a couple of weeks ago from some Hispanic families in town today, was about one of their grandparents who would have been born, their grandfather, he would have been born in like the probably late 1800s. By all descriptions, he was a larger guy, tall, kind of pretty strong, and he was working as a ranch hand in northern Mexico in the early 20th century. One day, at this ranch, somebody showed up in a truck who happened to be American. This guy got out of his truck, talked to the ranch hands, and simply said, "Would you like to come work for a railroad in the US?" The grandfather said yes, and his family ended up in Colorado. So kind of think back to what I was showing you about the, that's still legible, that's fine, kind of the immigration, the shifts in immigration from Europe. You have these companies that are now recruiting out of Mexico, but you also have individuals who already live in the US who know that there's now more work in places like Colorado. And the census bears this out. So if you look at Hispanic residents who are listed in that Louisville portion of the 1930 census, you can see about 1 out of 3 individuals was born in Mexico. So they're labeled Mexican and they are Mexican nationals, or Mexico as their country of origin. But for 2/3 of the individuals listed as Mexican, they're actually born in the US. Less than 10% are born in New Mexico plus Texas, and then almost 60% are born in Colorado. So we're going to keep talking about work now, but we're going to kind of think about the work that people were actually doing, recognizing that being able to talk about work can actually give us a sense for what people's lives were like. If you use the census again, and you might notice a theme here, we are stuck with the census for most of this content. You can see that of the individuals whose jobs were recorded, a lot of people were working in coal. Almost half of all individuals who had a job recorded. A handful, just over 5% of individuals who were Hispanic in Louisville in the 30s worked for the railroad, and then 46% worked as agricultural laborers. So that tells us something. Doesn't necessarily tell us everything. We know from work that the region, various museums, including our own, has done on the 1920s, that Spanish-speaking miners were a major part of labor activism in that period. This is an image referring to a major massacre that happened of striking miners in the 1920s at the Columbine, which is kind of out by Erie. Individuals were gunned down by the state militia who were picketing. But we know that throughout this strike that this massacre was a part of, the IWW that was leading it intentionally held all strike meetings in English and Spanish. By doing that, they were able to be successful. That is, they convinced the majority of the mining workforce to go on strike. We also know, and this newspaper does talk about the Columbine, that mines like the Columbine had significant Hispanic labor simply from archival records, kind of listing who was doing what. Those records could be employment records, they could be medical records, they could be a variety of records. The takeaway is just this: Hispanic miners were in the thick of things here. Right? If you're thinking about the ways that miners in the 20s continued, I guess, what would be a Louisville tradition of working to make their work lives better, right? Of labor activism, Hispanic miners were there. They were doing it. They were taking part in it. They were working to make this part of the region or this part of the state a bit more fair and equitable. Now, we also know that if you want to understand kind of what it was like to be Hispanic coal miner, you can't just focus on Louisville. This is an image of the Monarch Mine. Today, well, the mine site is kind of where Flatiron Crossings Mall is, off of 36. Now, the Monarch, like almost every mine, including the Columbine, had a mine camp. That is, they had residences that were right next to the mine. It might have a school, might have a post office, might have a store. And we know that in those mine camps, you had a significant Hispanic coal mining family presence. This is Joe Jaramillo. He's sitting with a few of his kids in this picture, as well as his nephew. Joe was born in New Mexico, so he's one of those individuals who was Hispanic who moved to the area. He worked at the Monarch or in mining for about 20 years. And based on the 1930 census, Joe and his family were one of 9 Hispanic families living at the Monarch camp. So if we're thinking about Louisville's Hispanic community, it's important to remember that communities don't just stop at municipal boundaries. There is going to be some overlap, and you'll see the ways that Hispanic communities in particular kind of were interacting with one another throughout the region in a second. Before we do that, though, I want to revisit this graph. So that graph I showed you, I think, is amazing. It's really helpful to think about what jobs people were doing. But here's the thing. Everyone whose job that was listed in the census who was Hispanic, or only 30% of Hispanic residents in Louisville had their job listed in the census, because it's only heads of household. That means any adult children, any women, did not have their jobs listed unless they themselves were perhaps a head of household because of some injury, or were head of households for other reasons. Basically, what this means is this. 70% of Hispanic individuals living in town did not have a job listed. If you think back to that conversation about sources, we need multiple sources to be able to understand what people's lives were like. If you're thinking about maybe in 1930, say Italian women that were living in town that might not have had their job listed, we have other sources that might help us flesh out what their lives were like. We don't have those for Hispanic families. Now, what we do have, as I mentioned, is a few family stories. Some of those stories revolve around school life. We know from various records that Hispanic students were going to public and parish schools in Louisville. This is actually an image of Louisville's grade school, second grade class. In 37, 38, there's 3 Hispanic students present. But we know from the conversations we've been able to have with Hispanic residents in town that students were physically punished for speaking Spanish in class. I do want to say that so were Italian students, in that there seemed to be a few instructors who were very, who required that English only be classroom experiences. But we know from the individuals who've been sharing with us about their experiences being with the corporal punishment for speaking Spanish, that contributed to senses of isolation and exclusion. We have these stories of Hispanic children mostly playing amongst themselves at the various schools in Louisville for a variety of reasons. And we also have stories about social lives. And these stories are, as you can kind of see, helping us flesh out other non-work dimensions of people's lives. We have stories of large extended family gatherings with food, music, and singing. In fact, we know that large family gatherings were actually the only time that some Hispanic children in town were allowed to utter Spanish while they were singing. So their parents would not have Spanish spoken at home because they knew there would be physical reprisal for their kids. But during these gatherings, you'd have this food, somebody would grab a guitar, and then soon singing in Spanish would happen. We also know that because, and think back to that graph, few Hispanic families stayed, very quickly, individuals were related to one another as people were kind of intermarrying, which limited your dating pool. So we have these pretty interesting stories in which individuals, many Hispanic young women, mostly of Hispanic young women who are now older and sharing these stories, they talked about how they did not feel comfortable either because of pressure from within their Hispanic community or from outside dating non-Hispanic individuals. They had to look to other Hispanic communities in the area, specifically in Lafayette, Longmont, and Brighton, for a date. And so again, these communities are kind of in contact with one another. And then we also know that there is going to be discrimination happening in Louisville. We have stories of white trade-only signs being hung in Louisville residents. Also, and I want to point out, in Lafayette, Longmont, and Boulder. So this is a regional problem, very much so. And we'll talk about kind of regional history in a second. But we know that Spanish-speaking individuals, Hispanic residents, were denied entry or service at businesses throughout the region. Not everywhere, but some. And finally, I want to point out this image because it's honestly one of my favorite. It was donated by one of the individuals we've been speaking with about family history. Left to right, we have Mary Durand, Isabel Tenorio Garcia, and Maria de la Luz Lucero. Isabel and Maria were Fidencia and Herman's parents, who moved with them to Louisville. At these family gatherings, it would be very multi-generational, which is honestly in some ways quite Louisville. So I like this idea of similarities across ethnic bounds. This doesn't seem to be shared with other ethnicity or racial groups. in Louisville at the time. So we're going to focus now on basically what was happening in the 1930s to lead to this severe drop. And I want to kind of take a high-level look at this at first. So as kind of the 1930s are evolving, you have the onset of the Great Depression. Basically, what is happening nationally and regionally throughout the West is that the anti-immigrant sentiment of the 20s is declining. Think back to that map of immigration. As fewer and fewer individuals from Southern and Eastern Europe are showing up, you see anti-immigrant sentiment morphing into anti-Hispanic hysteria. And I didn't say this earlier, but that part of that law, that national law, was actually to not apply a quota to Mexico. And that was on purpose. The national agricultural industries actually lobbied Congress to make sure that Mexico was not included in the quota system, which meant that you had a lot of individuals immigrating from Mexico, sometimes due to US hiring practices, but then you also, as we've talked about, had a shift in where long-term regional Hispanic residents were living as they move around the area. But that's happening specifically in the region in the West. What you see is lingering KKK xenophobia. So the Klan had, as a political entity, kind of dissolved by the early 30s, but you still have the individuals who are in the Klan around. Those individuals are increasingly targeting Hispanic residents throughout Boulder County. In fact, mid-1930s, you actually have the Colorado governor possibly capitalizing on anti-Hispanic hysteria as a political stunt. He stations troops at the southern border of the state to keep out anybody who is Mexican. You'll see I start to use the word Mexican in quotes. There seems to be no indication or awareness of the difference between Hispanic American citizens and Mexican nationals. Again, though, I want to point out that there's no quota to Mexican immigration. So in some ways, that distinction is not what it is today. And finally, and this we're going to talk about, what you see frequently popping up throughout the Southwest and the West is called to deport, or as it was often phrased, repatriate Mexican individuals. Okay, that's somewhat legible. But take a second and look this over. So I want to highlight a few portions. Repatriation is basically a fancy way of saying regional governments, whether they're counties, cities, to my knowledge, not states, we're trying to coerce voluntary movement back to Mexico for anybody who was classified as Mexican. Again, remember, we might be talking about American citizens who've been living in places like Southern Colorado for generations. And again, whose families had often been here longer than anybody related to the KKK, or in the KKK. But the plan is basically this. The county works with regional railroad industries to have a discounted rate, and then they hope to get individuals to volunteer, Hispanic individuals, to be shipped back to the Mexican border, where ostensibly the US government had actually negotiated with the Mexican government to have Mexican federal officials meet anybody repatriated at the border and then take them further into Mexico, back to people's location of origin, albeit sometimes, again, you're talking about people who either whose families had not been to Mexico in generations, or maybe had never been from Mexico, at least Mexico is based on its political borders at this time. All told, it looks like the county, based on kind of planning for a full or a half fare, the county planned to repatriate between 40 and 80 families, or individuals, I apologize. Nope, families, that's my bad. 40 or 80 families. So kind of thinking about Louisville, as near as we can tell, there are probably 30 plus families, Hispanic families in town. So that would have been the entire Hispanic population of Louisville, albeit this is a county-wide measure, so it does include Lafayette, Longmont, and Boulder as well. Luckily, it doesn't seem like this was a very popular measure. And records that we have of this repatriation plan suggest few Hispanic families in the area took the county up on their less than generous offer. That being said, we do have a few stories of individuals in the region, so Boulder, Weld, kind of various counties in the area, being, while not forced by armed guard, kind of coerced into leaving. And a few of those individuals were born in Colorado and have been shipped back to Mexico and have to figure out what to do. Because again, they rarely were actually met by anybody at the border, so they were just kind of dropped off. That's happening. Other things, as I mentioned, are happening regionally. Locally, we're still trying to figure out what has happened here, but we do know a few things, and this is what we've done. So this is that same map I showed you before. This is kind of museum's best guess at the moment on where Hispanic individuals were living in town in 1930. But this is 1932, and this is 1935. I do want to point out 1930 uses two source sets, a directory and the census. The other two were stuck with just a directory because there's no census that happens in 1932 or 1935. That's not the way the census works. That being said, we saw what happened on the census from 1930 to 1940. We know that there's a dramatic drop. I have to say, I am still trying to wrap my head around this and figure out what this means for Louisville and what to do. But this is kind of where I'm at, and this is where I'm going to end things. As I said at the beginning, I really believe the Prohibition period is one of the most pivotal, tumultuous, and intense periods in Louisville's history. It's this long Prohibition period, late teens all the way to kind of 1930s. And this is why. As part one of Beyond Bootlegging talked about, it was during this period that Louisville, things are set in motion that make Louisville eventually known as an Italian place. It's also during this period that it becomes really hard for Louisville to be known as a Hispanic place, right? We have two different ethnic groups. The story of Louisville could have been that we are Italian and Hispanic. It could have been we were Hispanic or we were Italian, right? Any kind of category or any kind of arrangement of that. And we get what we get. That is, Italians in Louisville, or Louisville becomes known for its Italian population, but not for its Hispanic population. I don't have a clear conclusion, and I wish I did. But the reality is, this seems to be what has happened, and the museum is talking to people to try to better understand it. But I also firmly actually believe, and this is a little call to action-y, that honestly, it's kind of up to the community to try to understand its own history. The museum can do what it can do, but the community has to decide what this means for Louisville as a place, how we kind of think about Louisville as a community. Yeah, in some ways, like I said, I wish I had a clearer thing to say, but I'm still floored by some of this research that we're doing. Okay, so with that in mind, if you got questions, I'm happy to answer them. I went a little faster. I anticipated more questions than we had based on our group size. But yeah, happy to open this up to comments, to questions, to anything. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, you mean? I mean, I'm not sure that I'm asking that about today, but yeah. But yeah. 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 Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an excellent point in that um, I don't think Louisville is not unique in this, right? This is racism, bigotry, exclusion, um, exploitation. They're part of they're part of history, and they are part of the United States history. The details can be different from places, how those kinds of things play out. And I also want to be clear. I mean, at the museum, you know, we get to talk about some pretty intense things, and this is one of those things. We also, we have plenty of great stories of humans being amazing to other people. Um, it's important though to not talk about this, or to make sure that we also talk about this. Um, yeah, I think the point about Lafayette is really interesting. I think there's more work to be done there. We've looked a little bit at the census in Lafayette and tried to compare some numbers. One thing that can be one of the many reasons that the census can be a little difficult to work with is census precincts do not match municipal boundaries. So in Louisville, the museum staff and Amy, we've all been able to work together to try to ensure that we're looking at different census precincts to capture who was living in town, so that when we talk about Louisville's Hispanic population, we're mostly doing that justice as well as we can. Um, I think we probably actually need to work with either employees of Lafayette or their miners museum to make sure that we do that with Lafayette when we really start comparing the numbers. But I will say one of the things that the census seems to suggest, and I will stand by these trends, Louisville's Hispanic population drops more than Lafayette's Hispanic population drops while everything is happening in the county. Um, I think that one way you can understand the specifics of a place is doing comparative studies. Is comparing Louisville and Lafayette and trying to figure out what's going on. And I don't know what we would find. We have heard stories as we've sat down with some long-term Hispanic residents that discrimination does lead to some families leaving. And most of the stories we've heard come from the 40s and the 50s. Although these are individuals who weren't alive in the 30s, but they do have some family stories from that period. And we've heard that some Hispanic families did move to Lafayette because of discrimination in Louisville. I don't know if the inverse is true. It might be. I know that a lot was going on in Lafayette as well. They had significant issues with the KKK, with kind of the ways that they allowed Hispanic residents access to various services. But yeah, there's a lot here.
What about the different industries? In Louisville, it's more coal mining.
Yeah.
Mining and Lafayette for agriculture.
So Longmont was much more agricultural. Louisville and Lafayette were fairly similar, I think, in their coal mining history. They're both on the same coal seam, and have similar histories. Lafayette also I don't know. I don't know if I have a working reason for this. Maybe my colleagues do. But Lafayette did not have a significant Italian population, at least in the same ways. So demographics are different in these towns. I don't know why. And sometimes things start for kind of small reasons and then kind of build in ways that can be difficult to even try to understand. Yeah. Yeah, but a lot's happened here. I will say one thing that I didn't really talk about, and some good stuff has been written about it, is regional Hispanic residents' experience with the sugar beet industry and with agricultural labor. There's a few. So the Boulder County Latino History Project has put out a couple of books that do explore agricultural workers' experiences during this period. And as you saw from one of those graphs, a significant portion of Louisville's Hispanic residents were working in ag. The museum is just we know a little bit about agriculture, but not really the sugar beet industry, or at least I don't want to speak for my colleagues. But there's a lot that has happened in the past. But I think these are really, really good comments and points. Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe. So most of the individuals we're speaking to today are part of the Duran. So Duran family. Let's see. I'm trying to think of people's last names. Lucero and Garcia Abila, Chavez. So the Chavez family is in Superior, but related to all of the families I just mentioned. Yeah, yeah, and a lot of these families have kind of moved around. I might be forgetting anybody. I know one of the residents was for a while part of the Razo family out of Lafayette as well. Um, yeah, um, yeah, 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 yeah. So I think so. The Gomez family is part of this as well. I'm just trying to remember when. Um, yeah, when those individuals moved here. Um, yeah, it's sometimes kind of hard to piece together histories when the people that you can talk to weren't alive in the period that you're trying to get. But then also there's just again not a lot of sources that would help flesh out things otherwise. Um, huh, okay.
Seems like it's language that is the divider.
Mm,
That's continuing.
yeah, yeah,
You know, and it's a barrier.
yeah,
Whether it's a barrier for the Italians or the Austrians or the Germans, whatever.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. I think, yeah, I think, I mean, the United States has a slightly different history with anybody with kind of Hispanic history and with Mexico and migration or immigration from Mexico as well. Um, I also think so. Historians also talk a lot about the way that whiteness as a category works over time. That is, race is not static. Who counts as what changes over time. In 1910, if you're Italian, you're really not white in the U.S. If you're Hispanic, you're also not white. But in 1990, if you're Italian, you're kind of white. And I mean, think about like the way that the census works today. Hispanic is oftentimes, or Latino, kind of depending on how we're categorizing things. Um, it's not a racial category. It's kind of an ethnic identity. So if you think about kind of the ways that kind of questionnaires can sometimes work, you'll have kind of people indicate their race, and then you will be asked, are you Latino, Hispanic, or kind of one of those categories. That's because Hispanic history is pretty complicated in the U.S. But yeah, I mean, for a while, I think one of the stories here is that some individuals who lived in Louisville, well, several groups in Louisville experienced prejudice, discrimination, and horrible things happening early on in Louisville's history, early 1900s. Some of those groups ended up becoming white and getting to enjoy more privileges later on in the 20th century than other groups. And part of the history of many communities like Louisville is figuring out what to do with, or part of the, I guess, the tasks for many communities like Louisville is figuring out what to do with that. Yeah. Yeah. You've all been great. I am grateful that you came out tonight. Yeah, this has been a project that's been near and dear to my and my colleagues' hearts. Yeah. I'm not sure. We're still talking to long-term Hispanic residents, still gathering stories, and I think at the moment, we can kind of say that this initial research project is, in terms of kind of this era, we're going to probably put a little bit of a pause on it while we're still continuing these conversations. One of my hopes is honestly to kind of get this information out there and see what happens with it in the community. So you four are here, chat with people. I don't know what next steps are. Further research by all means, but I think this is much bigger than just a staff of 4 at a small city museum. Yeah. Okay, you're all amazing. With that, I think we can end the recording. Thanks, Ryan. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.